right, I'll start recording.
Adam, your legacy is going to be getting us started on time. Always remember.
If I made one change to this community and this council, that's not a bad one to make. So
No, I agree.
And are we not expecting Sam tonight?
he didn't tell me he wouldn't be here, so we can wait the minute for him to get here for sure.
I talked to him moments ago, and he was planning to be here.
There he is.
Joining now.
Evening, Sam.
Perfect.
Howdy.
If everyone's here, we're going to go ahead and get rolling. And here's my script. Okay, just in case anyone forgot, we're doing rotation of council members for study sessions. So this is, I got the short straw on this evening. Welcome to the Tuesday, October 27th study session of Boulder City Council. To begin the meeting, we do have a couple of announcements this evening. First announcement, the City of Boulder has decided to fill the 2 open ex officio positions on the Cannabis Licensing Advisory Board. These 2 non-voting positions will advise the advisory board, will be appointed to 5-year terms beginning retroactively April 1st, 2020, and may be filled both by resident and non-resident applicants. We began accepting applications for this board beginning Monday, October 26, 2020, and will stop accepting them at 5 p.m. on Thursday, November 12th, 2020. If you are interested in applying for the Cannabis License Advisory Board, please visit the city's Board and Commission webpage at bouldercolorado.gov/boards/commissions. Second announcement, the state of Colorado has implemented a new COVID exposure notification system through mobile phones. This feature can be easily activated on your phone and will provide you with an exposure alert when you may have crossed paths with another person who has this feature enabled and who is subsequently diagnosed with COVID. The more people who turn on this notification feature, the more helpful the tool will be for all of us. Notably, the feature will not collect or store any of our personal information. This is a simple but crucial step we can all take to keep our rates as low as possible. To ensure your phone has notifications enabled, please visit addyourphone.com. And now moving on to the agenda, tonight we'll be covering 2 items: an update on the Boulder Bike Share B-Cycle Strategic Plan and the regulation of human and electric powered micromobility devices on streets, paths, and sidewalks. So a whole lot of transportation this evening. And I'll send it over to, I believe, DK.
Erica, are you going to start off?
I am, thank you. Good evening, Mayor and members of council. I'm Erica Vandenbrand, the Director of Transportation and Mobility here in Boulder. The staff is very pleased to join with guests from the TAB, Boulder Bike Share, CU Boulder, and the Boulder Police Department to discuss and explore with council 2 micromobility related topics. The first topic focuses on the evolution of the city's shared micromobility program. The second topic addresses where both shared and private electric mobility devices can be legally used on city streets, sidewalks, and multi-use paths. Based on council's recent direction, the city's shared micromobility program will be changing and evolving. For over 10 years, the program has consisted of a bike share system operated by a local nonprofit, Boulder Bike Share, which uses a platform provided by B-Cycle, a limited liability corporation in the private sector owned by Trek Bicycle Company. Council has directed staff to expand the shared micromobility program to include shared e-scooters on a limited geographic basis and to evolve the bike share platform to include electric assisted bicycles. To add e-scooters and evolve the bike share component, the city will be issuing a request for proposals in early 2021. The RFP process could result in a single operator offering both a shared e-scooter and an e-bike platform, Or it could result in 2 operators, each operating a single platform, one for e-bikes and one for e-scooters. In the study session, we would like to discuss with Council 4 potential scenarios that staff identified for the city's shared micromobility platform and evaluation criteria to be used primarily for the RFP process. The intent of this information this evening is not to select a preferred alternative program scenario, but rather to get your feedback on the criteria that we'll be using to evaluate the proposals from the RFP process in the next several months. And we look forward to hearing your feedback. Now, for the second portion of the discussion, the second item with Council is to identify where both private and shared electric devices can be legally operated on city facilities. Many community members are already using a diverse array of new electric devices like e-scooters, electric skateboards, one-wheels, etc. With the increasing private use and the changes coming forward in our shared micromobility program, the city will need to update our existing ordinances about where these devices can be legally operated on the streets, sidewalks, and multi-use paths. And through both internal discussions and community outreach, we've been exploring these options and would like to get Council's input before returning with recommendations and a draft ordinance in January 2021. So with that, I would like to turn this over to Senior Transportation Planner Dave D.K. Kemp.
Great. Thank you very much, Erica. Do appreciate the introduction for this evening's topics, and good evening, Mayor and members of City Council. I'm Dave Kemp, Senior Transportation Planner, and with the Transportation and Mobility Department. And joining me this evening is Kevin Kraus, Executive Director for Boulder Bike Share, Brandon Smith, Assistant Director of Sustainable Transportation with CU's Environmental Center, Heidi Van Genderen with CU's Chief Sustainability Officer, and they will be available to answer any questions you may have during the discussion this evening, followed by my presentation. Okay, having an issue with advancing the slides.
All right, you're projecting them from your end, DK, is that right?
Yes.
DK, if you click on the screen and then click forward on your keyboard.
That worked. Thank you very much, Chris. Okay, sorry about that. Over the last several months, Boulder Bike Share staff, its board members, and staff from the City of Boulder and CU Boulder have been engaged in a strategic planning process to determine the purpose and next logical steps for the Boulder Bike Share organization and the B-Cycle program. Concurrent to this planning exercise, city staff has also been developing the foundation for its shared micromobility program, including its goals, potential program scenarios moving forward, and the evaluation criteria to help policymakers understand the nuances associated with these different scenarios. It's important to note that we are in only the exploratory phase, and we are seeking Council's feedback on the latter. Staff has not made any recommendations regarding which program scenario would best suit the City of Boulder, but your input tonight will be helpful as we prepare for the upcoming request for proposal process to select a shared micromobility program operator. So a little bit about Boulder Bike Share first. As Erica described, Boulder Bike Share is the nonprofit behind the B-Cycle system. And again, this system was purchased through B-Cycle LLC, which is manufactured by the Trek Bicycle Corporation. Since 2017, we've seen an average of about 105,000 annual rides. There's been about a 60-40 split between community members and CU Boulder affiliates, 60% being those the city, and 40% in recent years being general community members. The system right now consists of 300 bikes and 45 stations, and there's about 15,000 B-Cycle members. Looking at the city investment over time, since 2014, the city has provided approximately $65,000 And we increased that sponsorship, that subsidy in 2019 due to a loss of a presenting sponsor, Kaiser Permanente. This was very much not unique to Boulder. This did happen in other communities where Kaiser Permanente pulled out as the presenting sponsor. And we increased our subsidy to $145,000 to keep operations alive. In 2020, through coordination with some of our funding partners, we were able to continue with Boulder Bike Share efforts, and we all pitched in to make 2020 a reality. And looking forward in 2021 here, right now in transportation mobility, we have approximately $50,000 budgeted. And of course, the impacts from COVID-19 has had a tremendous effect on the city's budget, much alone transportation mobilities. And so it's very important that we continue our coordination with CU Boulder and Boulder County moving forward to determine our best next steps with our micromobility program. I will say that since 2011, the city's $663,000 operational investment has helped Boulder Bike Share provide reliable transportation to 100,000 unique riders, introducing shared on-demand micromobility as an option for nearly 700,000 essential and recreational trips, 700,000 trips over the last 10 years approximately. City funding has supported this behavior change at less than $1 per trip. So in terms of system use, ridership did decline in April due to the impact of COVID-19 in our community, but has significantly bounced back in recent months, mainly due to the return of CU Boulder students who now comprise about 60% of our current use. And since August, average trips per bike per day are increasing. And so this year, Boulder Bike Share staff, city staff, CU Boulder staff, and Boulder County engaged in a strategic planning process. Their strategic planning process included several stakeholder interviews and a survey to which 285 members responded. The strategic planning effort was concluded in the fall of 2020 with a new purpose statement and a recommended business strategy, which we'll share shortly. But for now, here's the latest purpose statement for Boulder Bike Share. Empowers people through mobility solutions that are fun, safe, accessible, and environmentally responsible. In terms of considerations, the respondents wanted to see in a shared micromobility system a positive environmental impact, safety, affordability, and enhancing regional mobility all rose to the top, as you can see in this chart. And then in terms of the business model recommendation, I'll read this one. Boulder Bike Share will continue to partner with a private company and will be accomplished through a revenue share agreement or with Boulder Bike Share as a contractor. Boulder Bike Share may not own the equipment, but will operate the system, leveraging its existing relationships and knowledge of the community. Okay, with that, I'd like to shift the focus for the remainder of the presentation to the development of the city's shared micromobility program, including program goals, potential program scenarios, the evaluation criteria, and an evaluation matrix we developed to help illustrate how the different program scenarios work to fulfill the evaluation criteria that will be primarily used for the upcoming request for proposal process. So as we've worked to envision what a world-class shared micromobility program looks like, we've identified 6 goal areas that we'd strive to achieve in a comprehensive program. These goal areas transcend into evaluation criteria that will be used to select an operator from through the request for proposal process later this year. And I'm going to walk through these criteria and talk a little bit more about them. For safety, what we mean by that is the safety of devices used by the service provider, its operational practices, and the safety education of the users of the program. For financial viability, we're talking about the long-term viability of the service provider to remain in business. If any local subsidies would be required and what the profitability expectations would be if we went with the private sector. Looking at equity, this is the degree to which low-income and minority populations have access to the system and the cost of using the service. Environmental sustainability, the degree to which the service provides the provider's platform encourages travel behavior change to meet the city's transportation and climate goals, and the environmental sustainability of the devices of the platform. And then there's state-of-the-art technology, the level of technology and innovation that service providers can implement with their bike share platform, and the level of data access and sharing with the city. We're looking at introducing e-bikes and e-scooters into this program. We're looking at new technology to help complement a robust program. And accessibility, the ability of the service provider to respond to demand with expansion of geographic coverage and dynamic fleet size. And then finally, the responsiveness to operational issues, which is the ability of the service provider to respond to operational issues identified by the city, community, and users quickly and effectively. And so understanding where we've been over the last 10 years and looking to the future and thinking about how we would incorporate these program goals, we identified 4 different scenarios ranging in a diversity of partnership models and types of shared micromobility platforms. And I just wanted to walk through these different scenarios so everyone has a keen understanding of what we're looking at here. So scenario A would be to go into business with a new private sector service provider. The potential could be the existing B-cycle system would be dismantled and the Boulder Bike Share nonprofit organization would be dissolved. Scenario B is very similar to scenario A, where we would have a new private sector service provider and dismantle the B-cycle system. However, Boulder Bike Share would operate the system through a franchise model. And then scenario C, B-cycle LLC, again, the company that owns the equipment or had owned the equipment, Trek Bicycle Manufacturing Company, would operate the existing platform. And that could be with a partnership or without a partnership with Boulder Bike Share. And then finally, scenario D would be Boulder Bike Share continues to operate the existing B-cycle system through ongoing annual city and partner subsidies. And again, as a reminder, the city has subsidized Boulder Bike Share over the last 10 years at varying levels. And of course, the introduction of COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on our budget. And we simply cannot sustain the same amount of funding that we've done in recent years. Okay, this is the evaluation matrix. Again, that will be used primarily for selecting a criteria. But we wanted to walk you through this color-coded system to help you understand how these criteria match up with the different scenarios. The items in blue are to be determined through the RFP process. The green boxes currently work well to satisfy criteria. The yellow boxes works partway, and the red boxes do not satisfy the criteria today. And so for tonight, I'd like to walk through a couple of the yellow and the red boxes to help you better understand why those are colored the way we've colored them. And so looking at scenario C and state-of-the-art technology, the yellow box there, this with B-Cycle LLC taking over the operations of the current system, we would be able to include docked e-bikes as part of the program, with potential new stations, replacement of existing infrastructure. But we're still unclear on whether or not they'd be able to provide e-scooters and also the type of data that they would be able to provide for transportation planners to understand route finding throughout the community. And in terms of accessibility as well, it's more difficult to achieve the ongoing demand-based cap due to the limited number of docking spaces. The dock systems are a little bit more expensive typically, and deploying those in the community where the demand can grow or shrink is a little bit more difficult. Second. And then looking over at scenario D and going down to financial viability, the red box. Again, right now, as I just mentioned, this would be dependent upon an annual city subsidy. And in terms of the equity and being able to provide services in underserved neighborhoods, this potentially could require additional city investment. And then we believe that with improved technology for the shifted trips and device lifespan, that we can actually get more trips per bike per day on e-bikes versus traditional pedal bikes. And then when we talk about the state-of-the-art technology, again, these bikes with the current system has done well for the city of Boulder. It was a good investment. They're now reaching their lifespan of over 10 years old. And while they still work and are safe, it's time to think about upgrading the technology to e-bikes. And the same goes for the docks. The docking systems are aging as well, and we got to think about their future replacement. And again, the type of data that we currently receive needs to be enhanced to allow for better planning opportunities for transportation planners. Although I will say that Boulder Bike Share, through its app, has managed to document routes through the city for approximately 10% of the trips in 2019, which has helped us. And then in terms of accessibility, the same with Scenario C. It's more difficult to achieve ongoing demand-based cap to the limited number of docking spaces with the limited funding that we currently have. Okay, and now I'd like to move on to Tab's input on the matter. The Transportation Advisory Board is very appreciative of Boulder Bike Share service to the community for the last 10 years. Tab wants the city's current bike share program to evolve to become a shared micromobility program that includes e-bikes and e-scooters. Tab would like to be involved in development of the request for proposal process to be issued in the fourth quarter 2020. And they want to ensure that the evaluation and selection of an operator is based on quantifiable metrics such as ridership and change in travel behavior. And they expect us, staff, to continue to monitor and evaluate the operator's performance based upon those metrics over time. TAB acknowledges the city's current budget limitations that the Transportation and Mobility Departments has in 2021, and the fact that we cannot meet Boulder Bike Share's annual operational budget. TAB concurs with staff on the ongoing coordination with CU Boulder, Boulder County, and the Boulder Chamber. This is all very paramount to creating a successful shared micromobility program that works for all of our partners in the community. And that is our primary goal. Okay, looking at next steps. Here we are tonight, October 27th, talking about the results of the strategic plan and potential scenarios moving forward. In fourth quarter, we'll issue a request for proposal and hope to select a new operator by hopefully the first quarter of 2021. And then looking into the second quarter of 2021, we would like to launch a new or refined shared micromobility program. And the little note on the bottom there is we just wanted to ensure council that we do plan to fold both e-bikes and e-scooters into the shared micromobility program. Okay, so questions for council tonight is, do you have any questions or comments regarding the results of the Boulder Bike Share strategic planning process? Or do you have any feedback on the potential shared micromobility program scenarios? And specifically, we're looking for input on the evaluation criteria that we'll be using to select an operator here in the coming months. And so with that, thank you very much for listening. Appreciate your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks for that, DK. We'll start with questions first before we get into feedback. So any questions on the presentation? I see Bob's hand raised first.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, DK. I appreciate that very much. I have 3 or 4 questions. I saved my comments towards the last. Can you go back to slide number 3, DK?
You bet.
I just like to try to understand a little bit better. I know that looking likely towards a pretty significant change here, so we don't need to dwell a whole lot on the past or even the present, but I do think it's important for us to understand the current state of affairs so that we are intelligent about whatever RFP we issue and what criteria we might apply. So I'm trying to understand a little bit about ridership. So on this slide, it shows that we've had an average of 105,000 rides per year. Sounds like they might be down a little bit this year, but that's okay. I'd like to understand the kind of the breakdown on that 105,000 rides. First, I guess, first question is, as I understand it, there's really effectively two types of riders: those with subscriptions who can ride effectively for free for at least a period of time, and then those who might come in, particularly tourists, who might buy a day pass or pay by the hour. Do we have a breakdown? And if you need to defer to Kevin on this, that's perfectly fine, DK. Do we have a breakdown on how many of those 105,000 rides were like day pass hourly versus subscribers?
Yes, and you're right, Bob. Kevin would have that information, is the expert on his organization. So Ryan, if we can make sure that Kevin has speaking privileges on this link, that would be fantastic to answer some of Bob's questions regarding the specifics.
Good thing. Kevin, you're a panelist, so go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan, and good evening, Council. Councilmember Yates, I'm happy to speak to that. Basically, over the last few years, it's been the case that the number of trips from what we call our day tripper pass, casual walk-up users who are just paying for system access for that day, they usually take about an average of 1.5 trips per person. Obviously, no one's taking exactly that number. But that number has been going a little bit down as users of the system who have annual passes, either through larger corporate membership programs or at the university. And those people take, on average, a lot more trips per person, with the mean number of trips per rider of subscriptions being much higher than the median.
Thanks, Kevin. Do you have an estimate of the 105,000 average rides per year? How many of those rides are day trippers versus subscribers?
Yeah, let's see. I think looking even back at last year, I'm going to need to double check, but I want to say that out of 105-ish thousand, I think that we were in the low 20,000s were from casual walk-up users who were taking, just a little over one trip per person, largely tourists and visitors. And then the number of trips by corporate membership programs and CU affiliates has been going way up. And year to date this year, we're at about, I think we're over 70% of our trips year to date this year are from CU affiliates only. Those would be students mostly with annual passes.
Okay, that's good enough for my purposes, Kevin. What I'm trying to get to, I'm going to ask you a couple, 2-3 questions. I'm trying to get a sense for how many people use these bikes for commuting purposes. So let's just use your 20 or 25,000 day trippers. So backing that out of 105,000 gets us down to, call it 80 or 85,000 rides by subscribers. If I divide 15,000 subscribers into that, it comes to a little bit less than 6 rides per year per subscriber. Is that my math directionally correct there?
Except for of those 15,000 subscribers, that includes a fair number includes all of the walk-up casual day users. So
50,000.
even as of today,
so a day tripper is a subscriber.
We would call that person like a casual walk-up member. Like in the industry, we'd usually call them casual or walk-up members. People do not have a monthly or a yearly subscription, are just purchasing access for the day.
Okay, how many annual subscribers do you have?
At this point, we're right around 6,000.
Okay, so I'll correct my math there. Then, so it sounds like the average number of rides per subscriber is probably in the direction of 15 or so. Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with a handful of folks who have already ridden over 1,000 trips this year, and then plenty with fewer.
Sure, and that's exactly where I was going, Kevin. So I appreciate that. So if you've got a handful of like rock star riders that ride it, multiple times a day, 1,000 times a year, maybe they use that for commuting, that would obviously decrease the number of remaining rides among those 80 or 85,000 among the other 6,000 subscribers. Any guesstimate, if you call like a commuter somebody who rides more than 100 times a year, I mean, a round trip times 250 working days would be 500, but let's just say 100, which would be means a fifth of your commuting trips were on a B-cycle. How many 100+ riders do you have per year roughly?
Ooh, I love that question. I wish I had an answer for you right this second, but I can get that information for you and provide it back to council.
Okay. Are we talking like dozens, hundreds? It's obviously not thousands because that math doesn't work out, but dozens or maybe a couple hundred?
The question was how many riders ride over 100 trips annually?
Just picking a number.
Oh, okay. if it was over 100 trips annually, I'm guessing we're in the dozens.
Dozens,
Yeah,
okay.
we've certainly had it be in past years that the top 10 riders have had close to 10% of the trips.
Yeah.
But obviously it falls off quickly from there, and then you get more into the average, what we call, maybe call more an average user. Though that number of trips is obviously very different for a monthly pass or an annual pass, or even this year has actually seen the greatest use of our pay per trip pass that requires no sort of subscription in advance, and you just pay for it when you're using it.
Yeah, that's good enough, Kevin. That's helpful. That I kind of assumed that we were talking about dozens of commuter riders rather than hundreds of them. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and maybe this is a question for the CU representative. If 60%, I know historically about 40% of the rides have been taken by CU affiliates, students and faculty members and staff, but it sounds like that shifted this year, and whether that's a permanent shift or not, we don't know. But if 60% of the riders are now CU student or CU affiliates, and that continues into the future, what's CU's feeling about subsidizing a system, whatever system? We'll talk about that in a bit, but let's assume that a system requires a subsidy, and let's assume that half-ish is used by CU affiliates. How does CU feel about continuing to subsidize some sort of system going on? And anybody who can answer that question, maybe Clark or somebody from CU can answer that one.
Bob, I think that Brandon Smith is on the line.
Brandon would be great too.
Director with the sustainability program, and his office provides the funding, the current subsidy for Boulder Bike Share. So Brandon, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. This is Brandon Smith. I'm Assistant Director of the CU Environmental Center. And last year we provided a subsidy of $78,000, which allowed us to basically give out memberships to CU affiliates. And we have seen a great success in that. So I feel good about that subsidy and providing a similar subsidy in the future. Everybody's got budget constraints right now with COVID, as does the program I manage. But if the numbers work out, we would do everything that we could.
Thanks, Brandon. That was helpful. Adam, just with your indulgence, I only have one more question.
Yes, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. DK, can you walk us through the difference between option A and option B? As you said, they look really, really close to me. It looked to me like the difference between A and B is both of them would involve an RFP, and A would let the successful bidder, I guess I'll call them, operate as they wish, and scenario B would require the successful bidder to use Boulder Bike Share as a operator. Is that the primary difference between the two?
Yeah, you got it, Bob. Essentially, it depends on if the private sector, the service provider, or Boulder Bike Share would apply for they would respond to the RFP. So in scenario B, they would be the organization that would operate the system. So it might, let's throw out just a hypothetical company, say like Ride Fast or something. If we took in Ride Fast bikes and Ride Fast scooters, then Boulder Bike Share would then be the organization that would operate the system, but the equipment would belong to that company.
Okay. What if Ride Fast? That's a bad name.
I know.
How about Ride Safe?
How about Slow Ride?
how about legit? We'll just, I don't care if it's fast or slow. Let's just call it Safe. Ride Safe.
Safe Ride. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Was a successful bidder. What would be the reason there may be a really good reason. I just want to know what it is. What would be the reason that we would require under scenario B that Ride Safe would be required to use Boulder Bike Share as their operator? Like what's kind of in it for us, for CU and for the Boulder community? Sure,
and it's an option, and so it's one way in which one of the companies may solicit a response to the RFP. But I think that what we would keep or continue to gain is the institutional knowledge that we've had through Boulder Bike Share over the last 10 years. They've developed a number of relationships in the community. They're well known. And so I think maintaining their presence as the operator would be helpful. And we also have a great working relationship with them.
They're great people, and don't take my question as critical of Boulder Bike Share. I think they've been fantastic. They've provided fantastic service to the community for over a decade. I just wanted to understand the thinking between A and B, so that was helpful, DK. I appreciate it. Those are all my questions. I'll have some comments later on. Thanks, Adam.
Bob, can I colloquy with you on that? On your
Go ahead, Mark.
Adam, is that okay? Thank you. With respect to scenario B, if BBS were to operate the system through a franchise model, would that be a fee-based service that they're performing, or would it be, in effect, pro bono? And how would that impact the overall economics of providing the system with having a franchisee versus having the designated provider handle all aspects of the service?
Kevin, you want to answer that one?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I wanted to say that I think that maybe the best way of answering that is in many cities, the provider, the operator of the system is different from the owner of the system. And we here in Boulder just always happen to have it be a single nonprofit owner and operator. And the RFP process is looking to confer both ownership of a new system as well as the operation of it upon one entity. But I think option B would keep open the possibility that there's an equipment provider that does not do their own operations. They're not vertically integrated, and they're actually looking for a local organization to run their system.
But my question,
and the reason I think that it would,
how would that impact
economics? Yeah.
With scenario,
I think the reason it would impact the economics is highly dependent on the service area and devices and potential competition that company would be in. An equipment operator could be in the position of paying a local service provider like our nonprofit to run a system for them because they're making sufficient revenue to do that. However, to offer the other side of that coin is in most cities where there's a different owner operator structure, if it's a city or a transit agency who owns it, there's actually a for-profit operator who then makes money, is paid to operate the system, and is trying to then make money back for the city via an agreement, via a contract.
Okay. Thank you.
Are all different models of that.
Yeah. Mark and Bob, if I could just weigh in on that a bit too. Oops, sorry about that. I think it's important to clarify for you that these are just options right now that could come from the market, from the RFP process. We're not going to be shaping the RFP to cater to each and one of these different scenarios. And so we are right now just currently speculating that these could be potential scenarios moving forward that could come out of the RFP process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that helps.
Okay, good.
All right, on deck, I have Aaron up next, then Mary and Rachel.
Great. And DK, thanks for that last bit, because I was going to ask that clarification. So essentially, just to clarify, the RFP process is going to be fairly open-ended. And then these are some of the types of responses that may come out of it. Is that right? So you're not issuing an RFP for just scenario 1 or just scenario A or just B.
That's right. And we probably should have painted the picture for you better in the beginning. That yes, exactly. We speculate these are the types of scenarios that would come out of the RFP process, and that the RFP process will be built on the criteria that we've provided for you tonight.
Great. Okay. Yeah, thanks. Now it's good to have an understanding of that. And then just the other thing I had is I know we have Robert Hutchison from the Transportation Advisory Board, so just wanted to invite him if he wanted to add any color to Tab's feedback that we already heard, just to give him that opportunity.
I guess. Sure. Is now the right time?
Adam, is now a good time, or should we wait till after our other questions? I just want to bring it up.
No, this is a good time. Just introduce yourself real quick, Rob.
Sure. My name's Robert Hutchinson. I go by Hutch, and I'm one of the 5 TAB members, and with a particular interest in this topic. So I'm the lucky guy that gets to be part of this discussion. I think in addition to the nice summary that DK put together of some of our feedback, there's probably 3 other things just to emphasize. One is, and the team has mentioned data and planning in a pretty high level way, but I wanted to emphasize there are cities where what they're learning about who does what when from more modern shared systems is amazing in terms of really thinking about transportation dynamics in a city, particularly around things that are not the operational construct of the city. Everybody goes to school every morning, every morning, everybody goes to work every morning. It's the non-standard flow. You don't really look to these devices or these shared systems to be people's daily commutes. If they commute daily, they're going to have their own bike because it's more comfortable, because whatever, you know, you can guess it, right? So don't think about it as, oh, how many commutes are we getting rid of? That's not so relevant. And do think about what we're going to learn about the more random overlays. When do people end up downtown? When do they end up in the shopping? Do they shop with one of these micromobilities? So that's point one. Point two, I think people kind of get it, but e-bikes are a really, really big deal. E-bike sales in this country doubled over last year. In Europe, they went up by a factor of 5 or 6 in many places this year. For various reasons. There's more support for various people to buy them and things like that. But expect to see A, massive numbers of e-bikes, and B, if we have an effective e-bike service within this construct, we're going to have totally different classes of usage numbers than we do now, I believe. And I don't know how the CU membership affects that. Depends how we price. I don't know the route structure of the CU kids. A lot of them are actually pretty close to campus, so I don't know how that works. But e-bikes are a big deal. And then finally, just a little bit of a word of warning that I shared directly with DK and the team before. From what we know, there's a set of big cities where I think a fair amount of the wrinkles in the business model and the construct and how do you make money and where is this going is starting to mature. And that's the biggest cities. That's not places like Boulder. We're on the weeny end of the spectrum here. So we're in experimental land with respect to business model for these folks. So that's one of the reasons we said, maybe we can help a little bit with this RFP, because expecting somebody to come in and say, I'm 100% confident that for you little guys that are very odd and have a university in the middle, that this is the business model that works. I think you're going to get a lot of fast footing because they don't know. And so we have to run the process in such a way that we can learn and choose who's going to be the best in that construct. So those are our 3 additional comments.
Thanks for that, Hutch. If anyone has any further questions for Hutch, just feel free to put your hand up and we'll ask them as we go on here. Next up, we have Mary, followed by Rachel and Junie.
Thank you, Adam. And thank you for the presentation, DK and Hutch and Kevin. I have several questions. The first one is just, did I hear you say correctly, DK, that the 60-40 split, city, university flipped? So that it's, okay. And so do you have any speculations as to what that is attributable to?
Some of it may be the fact that students are not using transit right now because of COVID-19. That is one speculation that we have for the increased use. Mm-hmm. And we're not quite sure, and probably Kevin can speak to the general community use with Boulder Bike Share and why that's not bouncing back, or perhaps it is bouncing back, but a bit slower. But I suspect that has a lot to do with it. The fact that transit is no longer looked at as an appealing mode of transportation because of the COVID-19.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I noticed in the categories of requirements for the RFP, in equity, you had affordable and inclusive, I believe. Now, is that something that is going to be, yes, thank you very much. Affordability and inclusivity. Is that the affordability and inclusivity, especially the inclusivity, is that something that is going to be defined by the RFP, or are we defining for them what we're looking for?
I think that we would define what we're looking for and then have them respond through the request for proposal to determine what they're able to do. But it is our goal to create a program that, you know, has a sort of a cash payment plan, or potentially even a subsidized plan to some degree, and then making sure that it's also, so for those folks that don't have credit cards or mobile phones, how do they use this program? And then also making sure that we have these devices deployed in these underserved neighborhoods throughout town.
Okay.
So, go ahead.
No, thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that was that. Okay, great, thank you. Thank you for that. And then, so that was, I guess that was my questions 2 and 3. So the other thing that I found curious was in the next slide with all of the different colored based on their efficacy. I was curious about in the equity piece where it says required by business license. So is that something new? Is that something that all business licenses require? And how does that work?
So within the business license that a company would have to apply for and receive, there's a city manager rules component of that. And so through the city manager rules, we could define what that program, what we'd like to see in that equity program.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Now we have Rachel and Junie for questions.
Thanks, Adam. My first question is, I know that we're leaving the RFP pretty open, but it seems to me like particularly scenario D under the color coding is like dead in the water, and C doesn't look real viable either. So like, why are we still looking at those two, I guess, is my question.
Right, so council does have the choice to allocate funds as they see fit. Currently in our budget, we do have limited funds, $50,000 for 2021. And so if it was council's purview to continue the operations as they were today, we could work on that, absolutely.
So is that something that you're hoping we will weigh in on tonight, whether we want scenarios C and D to continue to be looked at?
It's up to you, absolutely. We'll take any input we can on the matter. And so it would be helpful to know.
Okay, thanks. And then just one other question, something that Hutch mentioned intrigues me, that Europe's e-bike volumes have gone up by a factor of 5 or 6 or something like that. And he mentioned that there were maybe subsidies involved. So I know sometimes the county has offered subsidies on electric cars and bikes in the past. Does the city, have we looked at any incentives? And if we, maybe have some funding that we're doing less for the bike shared model, could we be offering some incentives for people to purchase e-bikes, which are now down like at close to $1,000 for some like rad models? So is that something that staff is looking at?
Yeah, and so we're talking about subsidies for individuals to buy a private e-bike, correct?
Yep.
Okay, and Rachel, that is in our transportation master plan, one of our objectives to do that, just that very same thing. So there is actually a grant opportunity that is available right now that the city and our community partners are looking at to see how we might be able to actually purchase e-bikes for underserved community members. That's one program. We haven't identified other areas right now where we'd find the funding to provide the subsidy, but it's something that is in our purview and something we'd like to do.
Okay, thanks.
And if I could just talk a little bit more about the option D, I just wanted to just add that, you know, if it is option D that council wanted to go with, that we could scale back the delivery of the services under the current model if we have less city subsidy to work with. And that's where the scenario D becomes more viable.
Thanks for that clarification, DK. Next we have Junie, and if nobody else has questions, I'll ask one after Junie.
Thank you, Adam. I am slightly confused, and I think probably people who are watching us might be confused as well. I've been on the B-Cycle website and also the Boulder Share website. And from my understanding, actually scenario D kind of looks like a present system, meaning that currently that Boulder Bike Share currently operates B-Cycle. Is that correct?
That is correct, Junie.
Okay.
That is, so scenario D is the status quo.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I do have another question, and I think it goes back to looking at scenario A and scenario B. And I think I had a similar question to what Mary, I think that's, you know, just came up to me as well, was the idea of equity, affordability, and location, because you mentioned dissolution of B-Cycle, and I'm wondering, what does that really mean? Does that mean I am a proponent of e-scooters, but at the same time, I'm wondering what are some of the perimeters that, well, let's say you were to dissolve B-Cycle, well, people still have access to bicycles. What's the percentage, or is it just gonna be like, everything's gonna be replaced by mostly e-scooters?
So no, so scenario A and scenario B would include both e-bikes and e-scooters. The ordinance for the dockless e-bikes is to have an initial fleet size of 500 bikes. And then for the e-scooter ordinance, it's 200 at the start. And both of those modes are subject to a demand-based cap. That means if they can achieve a certain amount of rides per day, per vehicle, or per device, they're able to increase the number of units they would have deployed within the city. So we are looking at a combination of both of those devices available to community members.
Okay, thank you. And I think I like what you mentioned earlier about the undeserved community. And I hope, especially if we're going to a private sector, and I really don't fully understand what that means and how much say we're going to have in the locations or where you know, these e-bikes and new bicycles are placed, especially if there's a dissolution, whether it means that, will it be just a replacement side by side? Let's say, for instance, I know there are a bunch of bicycles in on the bike path near the Boulder Library and in different locations. Will these locations still be the place as well, including other parts in the community, or will it be left to these institutions or whichever is that private sector service provider? Will they be the one that choose that location?
And that'll be under the city's purview to determine the deployment locations. And of course, we would work with the operator, regardless if they're private or nonprofit, to determine, you know, where those best locations are. And it's somewhat organic in that demand changes, locations shift. And we've seen that with Boulder Bike Share, where we've moved some stations to other locations because there was a greater demand in a new location where there was lesser in the previous. And so having that capability of being flexible, but then also requiring the provider to deploy the bikes and e-scooters in specific areas is under our purview and is required through their business license.
Thank you.
Thank you, Junie. My question is on the timeline slide, if you want to go to that, DK. And it mentions at the bottom in your asterisk that the e-scooter program will be rolled into this shared micromobility program. And I was just wondering, that is with the constraints that council placed on it, correct?
That's correct.
It's not, yeah, just want to verify that that's still the case so we don't try to get ahead of ourselves accidentally.
Right, right. So the e-scooters are universal through the community, and right now we're still working with our partners in the community to determine the appropriate parameters for the e-scooters where they can operate.
Okay, but the RFPs will sort of be rolled out at the same time for bikes and e-scooters.
That is correct.
With those constraints.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. That was my last question. Does anyone else have any questions? I'll just give a second for more hands. Okay, then we'll move on to the feedback portion. So feel free to raise your hands for that. First up, I have Bob, followed by Sam.
Thanks, Adam. I just have 3 items of feedback. DK, this was a really helpful presentation, and thanks for everybody who participated and put this together. And this is very understandable and cogent. I have just 3 items of feedback. First, I want to agree with what Hutch said about the popularity of e-bikes, not just people who are buying e-bikes, but also e-bike rentals. I recently came back from a trip to New York City, and on several days rode the shared bike system there, which is called City Bike. And City Bike has expanded its offerings from pedal bikes to about 5 to 10% of its inventory now is e-bikes. And it's on the same terms. They sit in the same docks. And I think there's a slight upcharge. It's like 10 cents a minute. But other than that, it's exactly the same as the other bikes. I will tell you anecdotally, having done that maybe 10 or 15 times in New York City over the last couple of weeks, these e-bikes were fabulously popular. You can go on the app and find out how many e-bikes are at each docking station, and maybe there'd be 40 pedal bikes and 1 or 2 e-bikes. And people would flock to the docking stations and the e-bikes. People would stand in line waiting for an e-bike to come back so that they could take it out themselves. I even saw almost a fight develop between 2 people who showed up at the same time, wanting the last e-bike in the system. So I would urge us as we put together this RFP to have a big emphasis on e-bike rentals as part of this, because I do agree completely with Hutch. This is the wave of the future. And while a mix between pedal bikes and e-bikes is going to be healthy, I think the biggest problem they're having in New York is they have too few e-bikes. It's only about 5 or 10% of their stock. And my guess is if they made it 50% of their stock, they could keep all those e-bikes out on the streets. It'd be interesting to see what their ratio is of rides per day on e-bikes versus pedal bikes, but I'm going to guess it's probably an order of magnitude different. So that's item number 1. Number 2, as to option A and option B, I think it's great that Boulder Bike Share is willing to be on standby and to support any for-profit entity that wants to come in and provide this service to us. I think I'd just be really careful in the RFP to indicate that that's an option for the bidder, and that Boulder Bike Share would be available if the bidder chooses to provide local on-the-ground operations and share its institutional knowledge, its knowledge of Boulder, but not impose that upon a bidder. If a bidder doesn't need that type of support, I wouldn't want to scare them off and say that they must use Boulder Bike Share. So I guess I'd be in favor of kind of a hybrid between A and B. I think the RFP is well thought out, DK, and if Boulder Bike Share wants to be on standby to provide assistance, that's really kind of between, quite frankly, the bidder and Boulder Bike Share. And then finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't voice my continued objection to the e-scooter proposal. I know I lost that vote last time we talked about this a few weeks ago on an 8-to-1 margin, so I won't belabor the point, but I do want to reflect the fact that by some studies, e-scooters are 100 times more dangerous than bicycles on a miles ridden basis. And we see tens of thousands of people, no exaggeration, tens of thousands of people injured and even a few killed on e-scooters in this country every year. And I'm not excited about the fact that we're going to have e-scooters as part of this program, so much so that I probably would tend to vote against whatever proposal comes before us if it includes e-scooters as a part of a package with e-bikes. That's it.
Thank you, Bob. And just to clarify, the vote was originally 6-3, turned 7-2 in order to get it passed that evening.
Who joined me in opposition on the?
You, me, and Mark, I believe.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Mark, for standing by me. It wasn't as bad as I thought.
And next we have Sam.
Great, thanks. And thanks, DK, for the presentation. It was quite complete and good. I will note that the Boulder Bike Share strategic planning exercise is the one that identified the 4 scenarios that are in the memo. So I really view the scenarios more as possible outcomes to an RFP rather than something the RFP would necessarily specify. I do think scenario D just doesn't work at all, so we shouldn't think about it, as Rachel pointed out. But I just wanted to note that the scenarios came out of the Boulder Bike Share strategic planning process. I agree that we shouldn't specify whether Boulder Bike Share is involved or whether a company that's vertically integrated, who has a great response to the RFP, should get the award. So the way I read the Boulder Bike Share strategic planning document was that in response to the RFP, Boulder Bike Share would go seeking private partners who they would bid with, and that may be just one or maybe a couple. But I think that's probably the best role for us, is to acknowledge that Boulder Bike Share has a lot of local on the ground expertise, and then allow the market to sort out who might want to work with them and who might not. And so that's question 1. Questions or comments regarding the strategic planning process. I thought it was good exercise on Boulder Bike Share's part, and I hope that they're able to find one or more private partners to work with as the RFP comes out. I will note, I totally agree with Hutch and Bob. E-bikes are a big sea change. My e-bike changed my commuting habits greatly compared to just normal bike. A lot of reasons for that, but we're in hilly terrain, and tourists, for instance, could want an e-bike because they may not be acclimated yet. And certainly people who are carrying groceries or books or anything like that in this hilly terrain would probably prefer an e-bike to a normal bike. So I think that that is a big deal. It's a game changer for use. I'll point out that with the number of bikes in the current bike share program, 300 bikes and 105,000 rides, it's about 1 ride per bike per day. And I don't know what we're shooting for, but that seems too low to me. And I expect with e-bikes, kind of like Bob described, that if we have a mix, the e-bikes will be more popular. And so I think we should plan for that in the RFP and hope to specify some relatively high fraction of e-bikes to just normal bikes. On the subject of e-bikes, there's multiple kinds. There are e-bikes that are pedal assist, which the memo refers to multiple times. There's also e-bikes that are essentially just scooters, electric scooters where they don't have pedal assist. Some of them don't even have pedals. And I would like us to have our e-bikes that we're going to put the RFP out for be pedal assist. There's also blends, which are you can have pedal assist or you can just use the throttle. I think for what we're trying to get done, I would think we would want to do pedal assist. The other thing to think about is there's 3 types of e-bikes based on the max speed. We definitely want to stay away from the type 3, I think, which is the highest speed. I think we would want our B-cycle or whatever the program is, those e-bikes to be governed at 15 miles an hour because our paths have a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit. Type 2, my type 2 e-bike will go 18 miles an hour before the assist turns off. So I think we want to make sure and specify the type of e-bikes if we're going forward with that for the shared micromobility program. And then one of the things that you asked for, DK, was the criteria that we thought were the most important. And I wanted to hop back to that. I think it's, of course, safety is the first one that's listed, and I think that's critical. And that gets to Bob's point about e-scooters. And we've kind of restricted that e-scooter program to be in an area with less congestion, East Boulder. I'm not particularly optimistic about it, but I think it's worth a try, which is what we decided. So that's good that we'll go forward with that. But I think safety, both for the e-scooters and for e-bikes and normal bikes, is important. But I think right behind that also is financial viability. If we go through this entire RFP and we pick some model, that is not financially viable, we're going to have wasted time and money getting there. So I think evaluating the viability, the financial viability, and the number of bikes that'll be provided, and number of rides that we expect per bike, that's going to have a lot to do with whether this is going to be something that's going to last a decade or last a year or two. And if it only lasts a year or two, I think that would be a big negative for us. So to me, safety and financial viability. Equity, I think we should definitely make sure the RFP specifies the measures of affordability, but also where stations will be located. I don't know if the number right now, 45-ish stations, is the right number or not, but whatever the number is, we do need to make sure that we have geographic accessibility. So safety, financial viability, and equity are at the top of the list. Environmental sustainability, I really think with e-bikes, many of them are very sturdy and long lasting. They're typically built for people who want to run them for years. So I'm not as concerned with environmental sustainability for e-bikes. I mean, we should look at it, but I don't think that's going to be a challenge. I think there's dozens that could meet that. I think with the e-scooters, it's a much bigger deal. So, environmental sustainability to me is more of a checkbox for the e-bikes, but for the scooters, it's going to take a lot more research and diligence on what the potential providers are going to say. I guess I would also say I don't think it really matters if it's one company doing both scooters and e-bikes and pedal bikes, or if it's two companies, one for the bikes and one for the scooters. And then state-of-the-art technology, that's nice, but it's not, to me, as important as the others. Accessibility, I kind of tie that in with equity. I think they're, a couple different sides of the same kind of coin. And responsiveness to operational issues, I think it's hard to suss that out ahead of time. We know Boulder Bike Share, so that's good. We understand how they work. Others, it'll be harder. Maybe they have other cities they can reference. But for the criteria, I think the ones on the left of your slide, to me, are the most important, and kind of in the order that you have them listed. I think equity and financial viability are kind of side by side for me. So I think that's all I've got. I think this will be exciting to see what we get out of it. It is going to be a time for change. I want to thank Boulder Bike Share for all the services they provided Boulder for the last decade. I hope that they are involved with the next decade, but I think we have to let the private market sort that out a little bit. So thanks, DK, and thank you all.
Thanks, Sam. Next we have Mary, followed by Aaron, Mirabai, and Rachel.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, I want to agree with Bob and Sam with respect to the e-bike split, to perhaps make it greater than we may have thought to the extent possible. And then with Sam regarding the type of bike, to make sure that it can't go faster than what the speed limit is on our multi-use paths and bike paths. So those two things I wanted to agree with. And also, Sam brought up the idea that equity and accessibility are kind of similar or subsets of each other. And I was going to bring that up as well and suggest that what we do is that we combine equity and accessibility. And to me, equity is about providing access, and access is recognized as a 5-dimensional kind of concept. And the 5 dimensions include the accessibility, which is like accessibility for people with disabilities. And then you have the availability, which is what the accessibility I think is referring to in this slide that you have up. You have accommodations, which are, I think, part of, well, I don't see it included anywhere here, but the accommodations would include things like providing the information in languages other than English, and as well as making it available via cash. So those are accommodations. And then you have, of course, the affordability as part of those 5 dimensions. And then you have the acceptability, which of which inclusivity would be part of. So I would combine equity and accessibility, and within the RFP mention that we're looking at this as a multi-dimensional kind of concept, and include those 5 dimensions. So that was my main comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. On to Aaron, then Mirabai and Rachel.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment about the accessibility tying into the equity piece. Mary made it better and more thoroughly than I would have. So I'll just tag on to her comments and agree with everything that's been said about e-bikes and the importance of them and the game-changing nature of them. And just look forward to seeing what we get back here. So, I think your criteria are on target. And so it'll be really interesting to see what folks come back with. I also very much thank B-Cycle for their 10 years of service, and hope that the next 10 years involve them as well. But like others have said, we want to see what's out there and what meets the needs of the city, because we can keep those various scenarios in our heads as we move to the next stage, but the reality is that we don't really have the money available right now for the same level of subsidies that we've been putting in, right? So that's really unlikely to be an outcome here, although we can keep it in mind. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. Mirabai, Rachel, and Mark.
I'll just keep my comments short. First of all, congratulations to the 10 years for B-Cycle. And I think Sam really summed up most of how I was feeling very well in his explanation, but I will also say that I was not at the meeting that Bob was referring to about the scooters, and I also am with Bob in terms of not wanting to really support a program with the scooters. So I know I wasn't at that, but I did write a letter in, and I have big concerns around that, as well as I think many of our community members, so I'll just put that in there. But I'm fine with incorporating what Mary just stated as well. So again, to keep it simple, I'll just kind of go along with what Bob and Sam has said with Mary's add-in.
Thanks, Mirabai. Rachel and Mark.
Yep, I just wanted to maybe disagree with one thing that Sam said, which was about the pedal assist. And the way that I would hope that staff evaluates the RFPs there is, how does it measure up for safety, financial viability, equity, and all the others? So if a hybrid bike is more safe or more financially viable, why would we take that out of the equation now? So I would give staff in the RFP process maximum flexibility to get us a product that's going to work best for our community. So I would not be overly prescriptive and limit in that way. That's all.
Thanks, Rachel. So it sounds like safety is still sort of the most top priority, but don't exclude anything else.
In all of the ways that we are evaluating these criteria, if we limit what we're looking at to the pedal assist bikes and take off the ones where you can also, hit a throttle and pedal also, that may be taking the best bike option that is the highest rated for safety and accessibility and financial viability out of the equation. And so I wouldn't want to do that. So
gotcha. So, okay.
All the criteria, but saying maximize our flexibility in what we are evaluating.
Perfect. Thanks for that clarification. Mark and Junie.
Okay. I am supportive of the comments that Sam and Mary made. I think that we ought to be careful about what type of equipment we're going to put out there, and I want to make sure that it's easily available to all segments of our community. I do have one late question that I'll ask DK. And again, DK, thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful. Did I miss something? When we authorized a pilot program for e-scooters, was that not something that was going to be formulated and then brought back to us for us to take a look at, or have I skipped a step or not properly understood where we were going with that? And the reason I'm asking that is I would assume that we would incorporate whatever limitations were in that program in the RFP, And if it was the intent to have us take a look at that program, it seems to me to be time would be running short if you're going to go out with an RFP in the near future.
You are correct on the latter there, that we would include those parameters within the RFP, and we will be sharing with council, perhaps not through a council meeting, but through an email, through hotline, or another method that the city manager might suggest regarding the parameters of where the e-scooters can operate. We are looking at that right now, and most importantly, we're coordinating with our partners, and CU Boulder being one of those strategic partners with respect to where these devices can operate. So
as Bob said, I am also not a big fan of e-scooters, but if we're going to do a program, I would very much like it to be correct in scope and correct in implementation. And so it's something I would like to see before we go out to the business community and make it part of the RFP. How you do that, I would leave to you.
Very good.
Anything else, Mark?
No, that's all for me.
All right, thank you. And last, Junie, and then I'll go.
Thank you, Adam. I just wanted to thank Mary for her comments about accessibility. I think that's very important that we understand those dimensions. I just wanted to add that I agree with the need to fully understand where these e-scooters will be placed, whether it's gonna be near the bikes, or I think that's very important because again, I know that Sam mentioned it would be in East Boulder, but actually I remember the last time we talked about it, I could be wrong, it was somewhere near 28th and 30th Street. So I think it's very important that we have a better understanding of where these e-scooters will be placed, because safety of members of our community is very important. And we cannot just allow these e-scooters in places where we know it's unsafe, where, you know, with high traffic areas, we have to be very careful when it comes to these things. So I think, again, we need those constraints before we go ahead with e-scooters. That's very important to me. I'm still in favor of supporting e-scooters as long as it's in a safe area where there's no high traffic. And if it's someplace where it's in a high traffic area, I think that's gonna be very hard to support. So I think these constraints are very important, or these perimeters, and not just leave it to whoever, whether it's a private company or just, you know, whichever institution that we choose to decide. So I think accessibility and location, which is part of the safety, to me is the highest priority when it comes to these, with this new venture.
Thank you, Junie. And last, my feedback are, thanks for being on the goals area sheet. That's what I was looking for. I would love to see sort of what the metrics of measurement on these would be for the RFP. I think that's an important component, so we can sort of see what those measurable metrics are before we go asking companies what they can actually do. And along those lines, I share a lot of the same interests with Sam and Bob and Mary, and I think you're asking a lot of the right questions. I'd just like to see the measurable amounts that you plan on asking for. I also agree that e-bikes are probably coming up fast, and we should plan for that. I also really like the concept of docks, for whether that be e-bikes or scooters. I think docks, they really keep sort of the constraints in place that a lot of the community is worried about. Obviously, safety is still a concern, but a lot of the other concerns are whether or not they're going to be left or even create a hazard in walkways. So maybe making sure there's a dock component. I didn't hear a whole lot about that, but that's a personal interest to me. And I think that's going to be it for me. So does anyone else have any other input before I summarize and we move on? Just going to wait a second for any hands. And seeing none, what we heard is options D and C may not be very helpful going forward. But these are not options, these are scenarios. But A and B, we all seem to have a relative interest in making sure that the RFP process is open. There is substantial interest in weighting it towards e-bikes to some degree. The components of those e-bikes are still in question, but operating within speed limits might be a good option. Looking at pedal assist and non-pedal assist, depending upon what the safety mechanics of those are. And making sure that equity and accessibility are sort of top measurements when we're in the RFP process, to make sure that not only are things accessible, but they're accessible in the right places to reach our goals. And there are still concerns about e-scooters. We already all knew that. So making sure that we can see ahead of time sort of what the plan is for that in one way or another before the RFP goes out, just to try to alleviate those concerns as much as possible. And I think that's about all I had. Anything else, DK? Is that good?
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Council, for your input tonight. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Doing a quick time check here. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so I suggest we do a 4-minute break and reconvene at 7:25 for our next topic. Anyone disagree? Okay, here we go. All right, we've got almost everybody, just a couple missing. Just waiting on, okay, we're good. All right. So our next topic this evening will be the regulation of human electric powered micromobility devices on streets, paths, and sidewalks. And I believe, DK, you're still up.
Thank you, Adam. Appreciate that. And so, yes, let's shift modes now, so to speak, and discuss the regulation of human electric powered devices on streets, paths, and sidewalks. And joining us tonight, this evening, is Jack Walker, Traffic Commander for the Boulder Police Department, and also Bill Cowan, Deputy Director for Transportation and Mobility Department, who will be representing transportation operations. And so we do have a number of items to discuss with you. And it's important to note that just like the last item, we are very much in the exploratory phase of this topic. Based upon your input tonight, Council will return to you in January with proposed modifications to current ordinances to best accommodate our community's transportation needs. But to get us started and to help us become more familiar with the topic at hand, we'll first review some of the types of human and electric powered devices, discuss potential changes to the city's dismount zones, and then examine the types of facilities and discuss where these devices should be allowed or not allowed to operate. We'll then conclude the presentation with the results of our community engagement efforts and share input from our Transportation Advisory Board. Okay, we've seen some of these. Let's refresh our memory with the types of devices. These are human-powered devices. They are bikes and e-bikes, kick scooters, skateboards, and rollerblades. And currently, bikes and e-bikes are allowed on sidewalks outside of designated dismount zones, and they are allowed on multi-use paths and also all streets. Skateboards and rollerblades, on the other hand, are allowed on sidewalks except dismount zones and multi-use paths, but they are not allowed in the street. So allowed on sidewalks outside the dismount zone and on multi-use paths, but not in the streets. And we've probably seen some of these around town as well. A nice collection of electric powered devices. One wheel, e-skateboard, e-scooter, e-unicycle are some of the examples of these vehicles, these devices. And so electric powered devices are currently not allowed on sidewalks, multi-use paths, or streets. E-scooters are the exception, and they are allowed on streets per changes in the state statute, which passed in June of 2019. Okay, let's first take a look at potential revisions to the dismount zone ordinance. And so staff recognizes that the current distinction of where human-powered devices, including e-bikes and skateboards, can and cannot be ridden on sidewalks. It can be confusing and difficult for some community members to discern. Staff is proposing modifications to current dismount zone ordinance to designate the dismount zones based upon the boundaries of the city's general improvement districts, which correlates to the downtown, University Hill, and Boulder Junction areas. The ordinance currently in place identifies dismount zones based upon commercial land use, and this is very sporadic throughout Boulder. This modification would make it legal to ride human-powered devices on more sidewalks while maintaining the dismount zones in our high pedestrian volume areas. That is key. Another reason to visit potential changes to this ordinance is that there are many areas of the city where cycling and skateboarding is prohibited on the sidewalk, and in some locations, bike facilities may not even be present. And sometimes the bike lanes on some roadways, like arterial roadways, which have a higher volume of traffic and greater speeds, these can produce a higher level of traffic stress for people riding. And so they may choose to ride on the sidewalks because they feel safer. And as I mentioned, the revised dismount zones would expand the sidewalk locations in the city where bicycling would be allowed. It would also be easier for community members to discern where cycling is allowed and more feasible for staff to appropriately sign and mark, as well as educate users on the limits of the dismount zone. Depending upon which direction council prefers to go, staff would develop a communications plan to educate all road users on the limits of the dismount zone and how to safely navigate those intersections. It's important to note, however, that crashes involving turning vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists on sidewalks and multi-use paths adjacent to roadways continues to occur throughout Boulder, but it is done so in a non-trending manner, which is a good thing. Crash data does identify locations where crashes between cyclists and pedestrians have occurred, and staff is working to mitigate those those crashes. And so as part of this dismount zone revision, the Boulder Police Department has also weighed heavily in on this topic and has asked that transportation mobility staff perform a proactive view of intersection locations that have certain characteristics to determine the potentiality for future crashes. Once identified and evaluated, we would then apply the appropriate mitigation tactics to proactively prevent future crashes where feasible. Okay, this next set, we're going to be looking at the different types of facilities: sidewalks, multi-use paths, and streets. So for the same reason that people choose to ride bikes on sidewalks, people may also choose to ride their electric power devices on sidewalks. The primary staff concern about sharing sidewalks with these devices is speed. Many of these devices can travel up to 20 miles per hour and have the potential to cause severe injury crashes with other sidewalk users. These electric power devices can also travel quickly through intersections along sidewalks and encounter a turning vehicle whose driver may not be able to react in time. So potential solutions, if we did allow electric powered devices on sidewalks, may be to modify the current ordinances, which currently require cyclists to slow down to 8 miles per hour when crossing in crosswalks, and to also activate pedestrian crossing signals when present. And so if the use of these devices is allowed on sidewalks outside the dismount zones, these ordinances should be modified to address these devices, and users should be informed about how to interact with other users, including yielding to pedestrians. And then taking a look at multi-use paths, we recognize that many people travel along the multi-use path system today, and a lot of folks are using electric powered devices. The operation of all motorized vehicles is prohibited on multi-use paths and trails on open space land too. That's an important clarification we need to make. E-bikes are allowed on multi-use paths. That's another important clarification to make. And that was an ordinance change that was made in 2014. The Boulder Police Department believes that multi-use paths are the most appropriate facility for these types of devices. These devices can vary in braking and lighting equipment, but generally they do provide a method for regulating their speed. Staff does have concerns regarding the interaction with other multi-use path users, and if electric power devices are allowed on multi-use paths, ordinances should address their proper use, meaning speed limit of 15 miles per hour, riding at night with lights, using audible signals when passing, and yielding to pedestrians in slower moving traffic. And then we look at streets, and it's important to note that we are exploring allowing these devices on residential streets and only in the bike lane on all other streets. And so typically human-powered devices such as skateboards and rollerblades, they do not have the proper brakes or lights. And when in the street, they can travel fast and unpredictably. Skateboards, for example, require the user to cart back and forth with an entire street width to regulate their speed. There are also concerns regarding their visibility by drivers of motor vehicles. If allowed on streets, the ordinance should govern their safe and proper use to not cause crashes to occur. An example of this would be to ride at night with lights, to stay in one travel lane or within the bike lane and follow the rules of the road, similar to how we currently regulate bicycles, drivers of vehicles. Per the state statute, e-scooters are currently allowed to be ridden in the street. Other devices classified as lightweight electric power devices, like the one wheel and the unicycle and whatnot, e-skateboard, they are currently defined as toy vehicles per state statute and are not allowed in the street, whether it be in the roadway or in the bike lane. Again, if these devices are allowed to operate on residential streets or streets within the bike lanes, the ordinances should govern their proper use similar to human power devices. on streets. Okay, community engagement. We've been working with many community stakeholders over the last several months on this topic. People are very passionate about their facilities, whether it be sidewalks, bike lanes, or multi-use paths, as you can imagine. We've been in close talks with CU Boulder regarding these devices and where they're allowed to operate, with the goal of creating a seamless transition between the city and CU's campus in terms of regulatory expectations. And we've heard from the Parks and Recreation Board and the county's Mobility for All working group regarding concerns for our vulnerable populations, such as children and our aging community members, and about their safety when using sidewalks and multi-use paths, and concerns regarding the electric-powered vehicles mixing with pedestrians and people in wheelchairs. Staff has also worked very closely with the Boulder Police Department on this topic and the city's Pedestrian Action Committee to work through several of the nuances associated with where these devices should be allowed to operate. And of course, the Transportation Advisory Board weighed in on this topic at their October 12th meeting. I'll share their input next, but first I'd like to share the results of the Be Heard Boulder online community questionnaire, which is more of our general public input that we conducted for this particular topic. And we named it Which Wheels Go Where? And this questionnaire was live for a little over 2 weeks and received about 360 responses. And so I would like to walk through these particular questions we asked and the responses. And so before I do that though, to preface this next set of slides, we did provide a brief introduction in the Be Heard Boulder questionnaire to the effect of that we are working toward the goals of our transportation master plan, and that we recognize that these smaller scale personal micromobility devices such as e-bikes and e-scooters can help reduce single occupancy vehicle trips, provide more travel choices, and fill in gaps in our transportation network. And so with each of these questions, I'll go through them. And so what is your top concern regarding expanding the use of human-powered devices on sidewalks? Again, speed. People may be traveling too fast, may not yield is another top concern. And then getting there, the 9% sidewalks, some people feel sidewalks are already too congested. Some of the other examples are that they are too narrow. And some folks are not concerned about the device necessarily, but they're concerned about how they're used and how they're enforced. And then what is your top concern regarding the use of electric powered devices on sidewalks? Again, very similar to the first one. To human devices, electric devices, they have the same concerns, may travel too fast and they may not yield to pedestrians. When we look at their top concerns regarding the use of electric powered devices on multi-use paths, what was surprising here is that 42% of the respondents did not have a concern. There was no concern regarding their use. But again, speed, may travel too fast, is a common occurrence or a common concern that is coming up through this, the results of this questionnaire. And some of the things we mentioned earlier is people sometimes will pass without an audible signal when they're passing on the left. And they're also afraid of folks that are riding their vehicle or their device in a reckless manner.
Hey, DK, before you move on, can you explain real quick? It looks like the bars here, one of the two has to be wrong. Either the percentages are wrong or the heights of the bars are wrong.
Okay, let's see. Doing quick math, I could add them up. I tell you what, Adam, to continue the presentation, I can come back to that and figure out if there is a discrepancy and follow up with you.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. And then we look at what is your top concern regarding the use of human-powered skateboards on residential streets? Again, 37% no concern, 32% people not following the rules of the road. And then what is your top concern regarding the use of human-powered skateboards and bike lanes? Again, a common theme we're seeing is that there's a large percentage of people that don't have concerns with some devices and multi-use paths, and also on the streets and streets with bike lanes. And of course, some of the other comments, skateboards are unpredictable. We see a lack of protected facilities. Will be hard to get skateboards to follow the rules of the road. And then what is your top concern regarding the use of electric powered skateboards? One wheels and the unicycles and electric skateboards on residential streets. Again, 30% no concern. Again, not following the rules of the road, the unpredictability associated with these types of devices. And then what is your top concern regarding the use of electric powered skateboards, one wheels on non-residential streets and only in the bike lane? And so we are seeing some reoccurring themes in the results from the questionnaire. Okay, moving on to tab input. Tab is supportive of modifying current ordinances to allow human and electric powered devices on facilities where they are not allowed today. They believe that it is important to be less restrictive, less prescriptive, if you will, toward micromobility modes to shift trips away from single occupancy vehicles. TAB supports the revised dismount zone map and requests that staff effectively communicate the limits of the dismount zones to community members through education outreach, signs, and markings. TAB believes it is important to provide signing along the multi-use path that correlates to the safety messages identified in the city's Way of the Path program. And they understand the Boulder Police Department's limitations regarding enforcement. And then in terms of next steps, again, we'll be taking these, based upon your input tonight, we will then begin to look at how we might modify the current ordinances to achieve council's goals and the goals of our transportation master plan. And so we would bring to TAB in December proposed changes to those ordinances. And then we would return to council in January 5th and 19th respectively, up for the public hearing to look at these ordinances and if any changes are necessary. And then so for tonight, your questions, do you have any questions or concerns regarding the expanding the use of human-powered devices on sidewalks? Do you have any questions or concerns regarding the use of electric-powered devices on multi-use paths and sidewalks outside of the dismount zone? And what are your questions and concerns regarding the use of human-powered skateboards and electric-powered devices on residential streets and in the bike lane and on all other streets? And again, thank you very much for listening. I know that's a lot of information and we look forward to working through the details with you all.
Thank you, DK. Can you roll back one slide just so we have those questions up as we begin the process here? First, let's take general questions about the presentation, and then we'll go into these one at a time. Sam?
Thanks, DK, for the presentation. This is a subject that I think has long needed addressed, so I really appreciate TAB and transportation taking this on, so thank you. I guess I only have one question to start with. As I've observed the various flavors of electric powered vehicles that aren't e-bikes on the paths, the unicycles seem to be the one that folks will put a helmet on and armor on and go really fast on the paths. So I was curious what you know about those unicycles' top speeds. I don't know anything about them except that I observed that they seem to go faster than the one wheels or the electric skateboards or anything. So I was just curious if you have any background on that electric powered unicycle.
I know that Daredevil, the exact Daredevil you're talking about right now. He's got a full face helmet on, right?
Right.
He's got the electric unicycle and he's typically on the Boulder Creek path that we see him. And he's going at a pretty high rate of speed. Absolutely, I know that. I don't see too many of these users currently. I would say that some of these devices can be modified. I think generally speaking, the devices are regulated about 20 miles per hour, but it's not to say it's not possible to change the speeds that they are capable of going.
Got it. And just one other question. Given that some e-bikes type 3s can go faster than 20 miles an hour, and that obviously some of the unicycles can be modified and some have been modified, how does transportation and the police department look at trying to get the message across that on multi-use paths, on sidewalks, and even in bike lanes, that there are speed restrictions? Because I think it came up as the most concerning element on sidewalks. So I was just curious, you know, obviously the path has a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit. There's some attempt to communicate to users that that's the case. If we did this kind of changes, most of which I'm in favor of, how would we try and make sure that folks are abiding by the speed limits?
Right, so correct. There is a 15-mile-an-hour speed limit on the multi-use path system today. There's an ordinance behind that. And I think that what we could do a better job of right now is communicating these messages, and also installing signing and marking along the multi-use path that reflect the messages, safety messages of our Way to the Path campaign. And we typically today get all that information out through social media. We'll do periodic bursts of informing the community. But I think that there's more that we can do and be more intensive, particularly if we're going to be changing any ordinances to allow these vehicles. We have to go full court press to really get the word out there around these devices and what these ordinances are, whether it be the speed limit 15 miles per hour, or using audible signal when passing on the left, yielding to slower moving vehicles. These are all, I think, the messaging that we would have to really put out there in order to get the message across. And then having the signs in place and the markings in place in the field, there would be a cost to that. We have to look at that. However, I think having them in the field, having them out on the multi-use path, and so you're hearing it and you're seeing it, I think that would help instill a culture of safety in time.
Thank you.
EK, would you mind if I add in just a little bit?
Absolutely.
Bill Cowan, Transportation and Mobility. In reference, Sam, to your question about how we would handle this, especially on sidewalks versus multi-use paths, because I think DK did a pretty good job of how we handle that on multi-use paths today. We've got quite a bit of speed limit signing on the path system. I imagine we would probably need to treat our sidewalks much the way we do our residential street system, and we would need to identify those locations where we have an issue with people bicycling too fast and post speed limits on those sidewalks, much as we do with the residential streets today. We obviously would not be able to post speed limits on all sidewalks in the city.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you, Sam. Next, we have Mark, Rachel, and Mary.
Yeah, I really only have one question at the moment. The survey that generated 360 responses, are you considering that a statistically valid survey?
No, sir, it's only a questionnaire.
Okay, because you know, I note that it represents about 0.3% of people living in Boulder, so it struck me as sort of a thin reed on which to make judgments as to the receptivity of the community to various alternatives. So thank you. That was really my only question. If you have anything you want to add to that, please do.
I don't have anything to add to it. I agree that it is a questionnaire. It's not statistically valid at this point. But it is additional outreach that we've done, you know, in addition to the stakeholders. You know, it's not the complete picture in terms of the statistically valid survey, but it does help us understand what the concerns are from an implementation standpoint.
Do you have any plans for something a little more systematic in terms of outreach and obtaining the views of the community?
So that is a communications plan that we've yet to develop, but it would definitely be comprehensive and more robust than what we've done previously.
Is that something you're intending to do?
Yes, sir.
Prior to our enaction of specific changes?
Yeah, we can bring the elements of the communications plan to the first and second readings for council in January.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Great. Next for general questions, we have Rachel and Mary.
Well, it feels like sort of specific questions here, Adam, but I'm going to put it under the general questions category. First, on the dismount zones, which it's awesome, I think, to have them much better simplified. So that seems like a really good direction. But I noticed, like in the downtown zone, there's no bike paths and there's no multi-use trail there. And so we're asking people to dismount and not be able to ride their bikes safely, really, in a lot of downtown. So I wanted to make sure I was like following that map right, and then understand if there's any argument to doing something different than a full dismount zone. Like, could people have to ride, you know, very slowly there? Like my bike, for example, is an e-bike. It's really heavy and cumbersome. And if I dismount it, it's unwieldy. Like, it's much easier for me to be on it. It's safer to be on a sidewalk. Like, how did we land on the dismount where there are no bike lanes and paths?
It's really because of the high pedestrian volume area, and then the interactions, the potential conflicts with pedestrians, people in wheelchairs and whatnot. We do recognize that some of the streets in the downtown don't currently have a low stress option. I think that's something that we need to continue working on. But we do feel that it's important to ask cyclists to dismount, ask anybody that's on a device to dismount while they're in the downtown area. There's, you know, if you're accessing downtown from the north or south, there are many ways to get there safely and effectively. But I will agree that if you're traveling east and west, then it's a bit more difficult.
Yeah, like if I'm trying to go from the municipal building to West Pearl, say, like they're just not, you know, if I'm gonna have to walk something that's really unwieldy, it just doesn't seem like that. It would be great if you could, if we had a little bit of maneuverability in my mind. So just wondered if that was thought through, or maybe if, I guess, to Hutch, if that's still our TAB contact here, if TAB talked through that issue at all.
What we provided as feedback is that we were not so much worried about dismount or not, although we didn't have any real sense of, you know, once you start to get complicated on these things, there's times of day when there's no one around, and why we talked about that a little bit. But the main thing we talked about is, how do people know that they're in this zone? The boundaries are sort of these convoluted zigzags, and we were concerned about just knowing and getting messages out, and maybe the shape could be simpler, or what is it, and therefore how exactly do you think about those boundaries? That was our main additional dimension, besides what DK already summarized. Okay, thanks. I guess my well, I'll save it for comments. So my other question is, can you give the background on how we arrived at 15 miles an hour for our multi-use paths? And I'm sure this is not gonna be super popular for me to verbalize, but we're talking about e-bikes are becoming much more popular, and they're all set at either national or international standard of 20 miles an hour. That's the speed limit that both class 1 and 2 go. So is there any reason has staff or TAB thought about, like, should our multi-use path match what that standard is? And I assume that standard of 20 miles an hour for these bikes was set with safety in mind. So just wondering how we got at 15 miles an hour, and have we thought about whether, in light of this surge of e-bike use that we are predicting, where everybody's bike's going to show up going 20 miles an hour, and a lot of, they don't all even have ways that you can read what speed you're going. Like, is there any benefit to looking at what the safety modeling was, how they arrived at the 20 and how we arrived at 15? And is there any room to look at whether 20 makes sense?
And if I jump in on this one, DK?
Absolutely, Bill.
So unfortunately, I can't tell you where the origin of the 15 mile an hour speed limit on the multi-use path system comes from. That predates me. It's been in the the Boulder Revised Code for quite some time. I can tell you that we have not talked about increasing it. I'd point out that the ability for an e-bike to go 20 miles an hour, period, doesn't necessarily mean that we want them to go 20 miles an hour on the path system that has a lot of pedestrians on it. Probably best if they're going faster that they're doing that in the road. And so we certainly get a fair number of complaints from the public who walk on the multi-use path system about bikes traveling too fast. So we would be leery about wanting to encourage cycling or e-cycling to go faster on the multi-use path system.
And Rachel, I'll add to that too. And, you know, regardless of the speed, whether it be 15 or 20, it is important, I think, to implement some bicycle slow zones. This is another idea we've had through the Way of Path. So let's say you're traveling up the Boulder Creek path and you get to the Civic Center Park. This is obviously an area that has a lot more people walking and people biking and people scootering and whatnot. And so this might be a good location, you know, to mark these zones as bicycle slow zones or device slow zones. We don't know the exact terminology of word we would use, but to really be a little bit more strategic, more surgical at pinpointing these locations within the city where we really want you to be cautious. You know, there's a lot of people using these zones and we want you to slow down.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think to some degree, it's kind of like with traffic where you have natural calming if there are obstacles, right? And the street's narrower. And certainly if there are a lot of people and using the path, you slow down pretty naturally. So it makes sense that you'd want to specify those areas as well. I would ask Hutch, did Tab at all look at the speed of e-bikes and the mismatch to the trails?
We didn't discuss it explicitly. I think in general, the issue we have with speed is, you know, it isn't like a brake comes on any bike, E or not, when you hit 20 either. You can go faster than 20 on those things. I've personally done it many times on a hill or whatever. So to us, it's a more general speed limit question as opposed to a specific e-bike question. But beyond that, to my knowledge, and I'm pretty new to Tab, we haven't talked about it.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. Just to clarify, we are going to go through these questions one at a time quickly after this first round of general questions. Last, we have Mary.
Well, I guess I could fit my questions under some of these, but I'm going to just ask it as a general question. So my first question is about the General Improvement District boundaries. And if I recall correctly from reading the memo, your staff is proposing that we use the boundaries for the general improvement districts in downtown, in Boulder Junction, and on the Hill. And I'm wondering if those are the same boundaries that are used for other ordinances that we have, specifically regarding ordinances on smoking and on parking. If this is passed as proposed, would the resultant ordinance be the same boundaries as applied to smoking and parking?
That's a really great question, Mary. Would this proposed ordinance change be consistent with other types of regulations within these specific districts? I don't have the answer to that tonight, but I'd love to follow up and see if there is a correlation for other ordinances or regulations that are pertinent to the general improvement districts.
Okay, great, thank you. And then my other question has to do with yielding hierarchies. I think that you've made a lot of references to human-powered or electric-powered yielding to pedestrians, but is there any kind of thinking around, say, an electric powered skateboard yields to a human powered skateboard, you know, a hierarchy of who yields to whom? Has there been any talk about that? And if so, what has been the conversation?
Yeah, you know, we haven't split it out amongst the different device types, but typically it's been a bit more general in that people, if you're on a device, whether it be a bike or a skateboard, that you are required to yield to a pedestrian or a person in a wheelchair. Okay. But it's an interesting concept that I could further explore in terms of how we educate our users. I don't know if there would be much of a split. A lot of times you can tell, or you can't tell the difference between an e-skateboard and a regular skateboard. So it's hard to discern. But I understand what you're saying, the varying levels of capability that these devices have, and then there's a hierarchy in terms of yielding to one another.
Yeah, and you know, I recall that on, I think it was Leave No Trace, had a really nice yield sign that clearly said who yields to whom and when. Right. So that's kind of along the lines that I was asking this question from. But yeah. Okay, well, thank you. That's all I had.
Absolutely. We'll certainly look into it. And, you know, typically it's the people on device, anybody should yield to slower moving people on the multi-use path.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So my suggestion here is we go one question at a time here since they're all distinct. And we'll start with question one, obviously. Get your questions out first and finish with your concerns or thoughts, and then we'll move on to the next person. So everyone gets one shot. If there's any follow-up after that, I'll ask for a final follow-up, but one at a time, get everything out there, and then follow up as necessary. So first, what are your questions and concerns regarding expanding the use of human-powered devices on sidewalks? And I have Bob, Aaron, and Sam.
Well, I'm going to break the rule that you just laid down and just give you my overall comments, because I don't think they vary between sidewalks and multi-use paths. I don't have any questions. I can just offer a comment or observation, if that's okay, Adam. Or do you want
That's great, Bob. If you want to do it in one shot, that's easier.
I'll just do one shot. I was going to go exactly where Mary started to go. You know, in the world of boating, there are rights of way rules that are very specific, where, for example, powered boats have to yield to sailboats and sizes of boats and so on and so forth. And I think that as we develop these rules, I mean, listen, there's not going to be any easy answer here, because we want to increase mobility options. And we want everyone to be safe. And some of these modes that are only allowed to be on streets are probably not safe on streets because they're interacting with cars. But when we put them on sidewalks or multi-use paths, they're now interacting with pedestrians. And so rather than being the victim, they may be the perpetrator. And so I don't have any magic answers to what should happen. But I do agree with Mary that as we develop these rules, there should be a hierarchy, not unlike the rules of boating. And I look at it as 4 tiers. Number one, pedestrians. Pedestrians should always be protected, have the right of way, and whatever that means in rules, you guys figure out. But we need to make sure that pedestrians, which are our most vulnerable people out there, and it's the most vulnerable mode of transportation, always have priority, always have the right of way, and are always the greatest protected. The second in the 4-part hierarchy, I think, are human-powered devices. Like pedaled bikes. You know, Hutch made a good point that bikes can go fast, but there is a greater degree of control if you're pedaling your bike, and because you're controlling, you only go forward if you actually make it go forward with your body. And so I think on the hierarchy, human-powered devices of all types would have the second priority. The third priority would be power devices with where the control is well established, and I guess I put e-bikes in this category. E-bikes have been around for a while. Most people know how to operate them. Most people don't operate them drunk. And while they can go faster, and sometimes they're powered partially or exclusively by a motor, I think most people know how to brake them and how to steer them. And then the lowest priority, I think, and it's not to say that they should be excluded from sidewalks or multiple use paths, but I'm going to be very, very skeptical of their expanded use without a lot of great protection, would be powered devices with poor or little track record for control or safety. And in this category, of course, I would put e-scooters and some of the other not novel devices. And I think if you guys develop your rules along those lines, pedestrians, human-powered devices with good control, power devices with bad control or bad safety records, I think that will help you pull together rules on sidewalks and on paths and on streets that will protect the most vulnerable folks while still allowing other modes of transportation to share the way, as you say. And so that's, I'm going to give you a very general guidance. I'm going to look forward to community engagement and then whatever you bring forward in January.
Thank you, Bob. If anyone else feels that they just want to have a more generalized input, that's totally fine too, but we're going to try to stick with question one. Aaron?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I'm going to go a little more general too, if you don't mind, be another rule breaker along with Bob. Yeah, I mean, this is exciting to see. I think these micro-mobility options, really expand the opportunities to get away from, your single occupant vehicle trips. So I'm really glad to see us updating our regulations, and also particularly to replace the kind of patchwork of where bicycles can ride on sidewalks and where they can't, which has been very confusing in the past. So that's really great to see. So thanks for taking this on. Bob, I appreciated your hierarchy idea. I was going to say something similar, that I think we want to try to allow more devices rather than fewer, so that we do expand those opportunities for different types of transportation. But we really need to be careful, about the safety of them at the same time. So I know you're thinking about that carefully, and I'll just urge you to keep thinking about that carefully from a safety perspective, because I think this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of situation. That you don't have the same regulation for a human-pedaled bicycle as you do for a electric unicycle, for example. So look forward to seeing what you come up with on that side. The one other piece of feedback I wanted to offer was that I'm not 100% sure that the general improvement district boundaries are the exact boundaries to use for the dismount zones. I mean, I absolutely support, dismount zones in the core of our downtown area where the pedestrian traffic is the highest. But, as Community Cycles pointed out in their email, we don't have a good low stress bicycle network all through the downtown. So is there a way of reconciling those two things somewhat so that, yes, you have to dismount, of course, on the mall and in other of the most highest pedestrian areas, but, could we maybe not have the exact boundaries as the improvement district and maybe give people some more opportunities for a safe way to ride in the downtown where the pedestrian volumes aren't quite as high. And I'll say the same thing about Boulder Junction, that I was a little unclear why that improvement district was included in the dismount zones, because right now it doesn't have that high level of pedestrian traffic, and it doesn't feel necessarily that different to me than other commercial areas. So, and the bounds of it are a little arbitrary. So that would be one that I just ask you to go look at, and kind of, I'm sure you're doing this, but get out the pencil and look at the map of the Boulder Junction area and say, is this exactly where we want a dismount zone, and is it here and not any other place in East Boulder? If no other place in East Boulder has one, do we need one here? And if so, exactly where? So I think that's it just on the dismount zones. But obviously, in all of those considerations, it's a matter of balancing safety concerns, right? So you need to protect the pedestrians, but also how can we find the safe ways of getting people on these devices through these areas. Thanks very much. Look forward to the next stages.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron. Next we have Sam, then Mary, Rachel, and Mirabai.
Thanks, Adam. I'm going to give my comments on all of these. I'm going to be a rule breaker as well, and then I'm going to have to bow out for the evening for personal reasons, but I do want to commend staff for bringing this forward. It is a huge improvement. So the dismount zones, we can quibble about exactly where the boundaries are, but I think starting with the improvement district boundaries is a great place to start. The map is far more comprehensible than what's currently in place. And I will say that given the more limited areas, the improvement districts, it's going to be a lot easier to sign that it's a dismount zone wherever the actual boundaries are. One of the problems is, you know, in the current situation, there's no way to sign all the commercial districts across the city. And this will enable, I think, a much more clear understanding of people, where they can be and not be. I think human-powered devices on sidewalks is fine. I agree with Mary and Bob about hierarchy. I will put out there the national trail system. You've got horseback, you've got hikers, and you've often got bicyclists, and there's a hierarchy there. And so lots of different travel modalities have hierarchies, and a lot of times it has to do with speed. And so I'm quite happy with human-powered devices on sidewalks. I'm a lot more unclear on the electric-powered devices on sidewalks. I think they should be on multi-use paths as long as they're obeying the speed limit. And I think it would be a huge mistake to change the speed limit any higher than 15, because that speed differential is already enough to scare many pedestrians who will complain, as DK said, about that. And, you know, many bicyclists, to their not credit, don't let you know when they're passing on the left. And so I think that's another way of the path thing, that if we do on multi-use paths have a lot more electric powered devices, we need to get people clear that when they're approaching, particularly on these electric devices, which are very quiet, that they need to give pedestrians particularly some kind of indication that they're overtaking them. And so I'm a huge fan of the dismount zone change. I really think we want to be careful about these electric powered vehicles on sidewalks. So the way I think about it is, if there is a bike lane, I think the electric powered devices need to be in the bike lane rather than on the sidewalk. And in many places, you do have both a bike lane and the sidewalk. The complexity comes in places like 28th Street, where you have a multi-use path on one side and a sidewalk on the other side, and there's no facility where one of those electric powered micromobility devices could go. So I feel like, to number one, yes, on all human powered devices on sidewalks, I'd be much more careful about the electric powered devices on sidewalks, but I think multi-use paths is great. And I think you'll get that figured out. And then I think I have very little concern, as many of the people who responded to the surveys, about having these electric powered and human powered vehicles on residential streets. I think that's a no-brainer. That typically, particularly with 20-mile-an-hour speed limits, they're not going to be slowing people down very much generally. And then, you know, in the bike lane on other streets, I think that's perfectly legit. And I think, you know, it is important that all types of skateboards and these one wheels have a place to be, because, you know, skateboards, whether electric or human powered, are a perfectly legit way to get around town. And so I'm glad that we will allow them in bike lanes. So the only, of all the things that staff has proposed, the only one that I am a little bit hesitant about is these electric powered devices, entirely electric powered, on sidewalks. So that's all I've got. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam, and have a good evening. Next we have Mary, Rachel, and Mirabai.
Thank you, Adam. So I will agree with Sam in terms of the answer to the questions, and the biggest concern is to have electric powered devices on sidewalks. And then, you know, with respect to raising the speed limit and multi-use paths, I think that the speed differential between walking and somebody going 20 miles per hour is just too much. It's too much at 15 miles per hour. it's too much at going pedal powered bike speed on a multi-use path and then having an e-bike go by you at 15 miles per hour. So I think that it's about the speed differentials and the safety that is associated with those differentials. So, so I would not be in favor of raising the speed limit to accommodate how fast an e-bike can go. By that logic, I would question why we went to 20 is plenty, because cars can go, well, as we know, pretty fast. But I wanted to just talk about the boundaries on the general improvement districts. I think that it would be helpful to people who understand general improvement district boundaries and people who are business owners in those districts to understand that that it's the same, if it is the same with smoking, if it is the same with parking, that the rules that apply to bicycles be the same, just to kind of keep it all tidy. However, it's kind of a hybrid thinking about this, where the rules would apply within the boundaries of the districts, but signage for dismount zones would be focused on those high pedestrian areas and places where people would probably need to dismount anyway. So I think that the signage wouldn't necessarily be all over the Cajun, for example, but it would be in those areas that are just very high pedestrian. And of course, people are going to not dismount in dismount zones, and people are going to ride within the general improvement districts. But most people, I think, tend to use some level of common sense. And it's only in terms of enforcement, or should an accident happen, that these solid rules and these ordinances come into play. So, so that's that on the boundaries. And then, yeah, I would agree with Bob on the hierarchy on who yields to whom. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Mary. Rachel, Mirabai, and Mark.
Thanks, Adam. I agree with most of what's been said. Obviously, I would prefer that we have the data on 15 versus 20 miles an hour and not go with our guts so much on that. So I think that is worth looking at. I think overall, this is moving in an awesome direction. You know, our goal is to get people out of cars, and this is going to help facilitate that. So I think it's awesome. Like I said, I like the way that we have shrunk the footprint for the dismount zones. I still think maybe we're not like thinking through that all the way, you know, in terms of like right of ways and yielding. You know, you obviously can have a somewhere in one of those districts where it's going to be dismount, that sometimes it's really light traffic, you know, it's later at night or whatever, and nobody's there. And you're also going to have the inverse outside of those districts where it's really heavy traffic on sidewalks sometimes. And I think that the goal is that you need to slow the bikes down when you are dealing with pedestrian, you know, heavy pedestrian traffic wherever you are. So I guess I just wonder, like, is what we need really these dismount zones that are, you know, super rigid, or do we really need education and focus on the yielding and slowing down? And in some areas, like we've said, you're almost always going to have to slow down, and signage would be great there. But I guess I'm glad that there are going to be fewer and easier to understand dismount zones, but I might prefer to see us focus more on education and always riding in keeping with whatever the pedestrian circumstances are. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel, Mirabai, and Mark.
So I also agree with most of what's been said. So first I'll go off of Bob's hierarchy. I think that makes perfect sense. I do have one question. I may have missed it, but I guess with the implementation of everything that we're doing, is there going to be a chance then in whatever 6 months or a year after the implementation for the community to let us know how this is working? Because I kind of understand where Rachel's coming from with the education and the dismount zones and not being so strict. However, then my concern comes to the people who are going to be like, oh, I can, you know, weasel my way through the few people that are there. And then next thing you know, you have crashes. And so then the education's not working because the few are ruining it, which you know, the 5% always kill you. You know, that's always going to be concerning. And it'd be nice to have the feedback as to what's working, because I'd prefer to have the dismount zones not be as strict as Rachel's saying. But then if it doesn't work, you know, it'd be good to know on that. So I think having a really good, more inclusive community feedback after this has been implemented is what I'd like to see. Because again, I think a lot of this is going to be working and adjusting to see how this affects the many different varieties of people. Again, one of the biggest things I always hear is that the bikes don't signal and the people walking are jumping out of the way. And I mean, that happens. We have a walking path behind our house and it happens constantly, and they're running through there like they own the walking path, and there's tons and tons of people walking and they have their dogs and whatnot. And so I guess, yeah, just seeing a robust community engagement after this is implemented would be fantastic. And other than that, I guess I pretty much agree with what's been said, and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you, Mirabai. And I have Mark and then Bob, but if Junie wants to weigh in, I would take her weighing in before Bob gets the second chance.
Okay. I also feel that Bob has properly articulated the distinctions and the hierarchy we ought to be following. I have a grave concern about putting electric powered vehicles on sidewalks generally. I think protection of pedestrians has to be our first and highest value, especially since some of those pedestrians are going to be children or the elderly or other people who are not quite as nimble in terms of getting out of the way of someone who's careening down the sidewalk with an electric powered apparatus. I don't have the same concern on the multi-use paths. And so I'm fine with electric vehicles there. And I'm also okay with them on residential streets and in the bike lanes, and some of them should probably be restricted to residential streets and bike lanes. But sidewalks are something of a bridge too far for me, especially with respect to electric vehicles. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Junie, did you want to weigh in, or should I go to Bob?
Sure, yes. I heard everything that everyone was saying. I'm just not sure exactly where I stand on a lot of these questions. I have had, since the pandemic, and I have been doing a lot of walking on the bike path, and I've done, I think it's like 6 miles, and I've done it every day for the past 5 months, and I really enjoyed it. And I have seen a few of those electric bikes, and it's pretty scary, and I was startled. So I'm not so sure if I agree with the idea of putting electric bikes on the bike path. And again, when you think about it, when you're walking on the bike path, it's very narrow. It's very narrow. So I'm thinking if there is bicycle, and then there is, you know, just human powered bicycle, and then there's electric vehicle. And if it can go really fast, I'm just thinking, I mean, accidents can happen at any moment, but I'm just thinking it's so narrow, and then you have a speeding vehicle just going by really quickly. So I'm not so sure about that. I like the idea of yielding to pedestrians. And I have to say, when I first started walking on the bike path, there were times I wasn't sure where I was walking, and then I'll see the sign that says, oh, you need to be on this side of the road. So I think that's very important to have these signs that say you need to yield to pedestrian if we're going to allow these type of vehicles. And as far as the sidewalk, I mean, I guess since that's where we're heading, of course, I wouldn't prefer it to have an electric vehicle on the sidewalk, but then again, if that's where we're heading, that's where we're heading. But again, I think it's how do we use our roads and our streets, because we tend to prioritize cars, maybe, you know, having more access to bike lanes. I would prefer all these vehicles to be on bike lanes, because now there's like almost a conflict between people and bicycles and electric vehicles, and we don't want these conflicts. So I think it's a very, very difficult discussion to have when we know we don't have, whether it's the space or the street management, because I think that's where we should start first with the street management, then talk about where we're gonna put these things, because we don't have the proper street management. All we're gonna have is really conflict. And I think Mary mentioned, you know, having the data. I think that's gonna be important to know whether we're doing the safe thing when it comes to our community members.
Thank you, Junie. And for second go-arounds, we have Bob and Rachel.
I just wanted to comment on the 15 miles an hour versus 20 miles an hour. And if you'll indulge me, I wanted to geek out a little bit on physics. And I know that's a real dangerous thing with traffic engineers on the line who are a lot smarter than me, but the impact by being hit at 15 miles an hour is not proportionate to being hit at 20 miles an hour. In other words, 20 miles an hour is not 1/3 worse. It's actually twice as bad because of the way velocity and kinetics work. Kinetic energy is measured as a square of velocity. So if you had a 100-kilogram person in a bike going 15 miles an hour and they hit something, they're hitting it with an impact or kinetic energy of 2,500 joules. If you bump that up to 20 miles an hour, it almost doubles to 4,500 joules. So I just want us to bear in mind that that incremental changes in speed limits have a more than linear impact, or literally speaking, linear effect when there's an impact or a collision. So I would very much be in favor of keeping things at 15 miles an hour, and would actually even welcome a discussion of lowering things below 15, but 15 has to be absolutely the max because of the way the physics work.
Thank you, Bob. Rachel?
Yep, two things. I like Mirabai's idea as well of having ongoing engagement and feedback about this, so wanted to support that. And second, you know, I feel like we're quibbling here over leftovers, so I just wanna pan out a bit and say that cars get all the space, and what would be best is if we were creating protected bike lanes downtown where, you know, where I'm worried about having to dismount my bike so I can go on the sidewalk safely, because we don't have bike lanes, let alone protected ones there. So I think this is a little bit of we're moving in a good direction, but it's also a bummer of a conversation because it's not very expansive thinking about taking some of the space really away from cars and redirecting it so that we don't have to fight about, you know, 15 versus 20 miles an hour for the e-bikes who might come into contact with pedestrians, but creating more for everyone who's not in a car. So that's really the conversation that I would like this council to be having and the city to be having. And I don't know if and when that might get lifted up, but we're really fighting over the leftovers here, and that just makes me a little sad. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. If no one else has anything, I'll weigh in real quick. I do agree this is sort of like, hey, fixing with a Band-Aid what the major issues are in transportation in the city, but it's definitely a step that needs to be accomplished regardless. These rules need to be updated. I think dismount zones are still pretty necessary, and we could discuss where they're very necessary, but to me, I think in a lot of cases, they're sort of a suggestion and not a something that really is well enforced, simply because I can see people blow right through them. There's not a physical barrier, you know, there's not a stanchion or anything there that really indicates, hey, you have to get off your bike. It's just sort of written on the ground, which can be easily ignored. So maybe something in that regard to the really, really high density, switching from a bike lane to a high density traffic area. I think we may have to go a little harder on the dismount zones, but I agree. They could be looked at zone by zone to see what's really necessary overall. I also have just a slight suggestion. CU generally has like sort of a, hey, welcome to CU curriculum, here's some rules type of things. This might be the general traffic rules might be a really helpful thing to collaborate with CU to have them take, a 10-question primer as they enter school so that they know the rules going in. So we can avoid a whole lot of the conversation and sort of negative results we might see. Just so everybody knows the rules when they get here, and not everybody reads the street signs as they should, but if you have to pass this little thing going into CU, we know for sure you know the rules. That type of thing I think is always a good way to collaborate so that the city and CU are on the same page, and students and community members are really good at knowing the rules altogether. With that being said, that's my input. Does anyone have anything else to add before I go over the synopsis real quick? Gonna wait just a second for hands. Cool, seeing none. I heard a lot about developing a hierarchy. That was one of the major things. The general improvement district boundaries are a good starting place, but they could be refined beyond that, several people thought. There was a question of whether or not we should look at the speed limit data to see where the safety comes into effect there. Several people were against it even without the data, but the data could still be collected. Let's see. There was a lot of questions about dismount zones, whether they should exist at all, or if we could just narrow their scope or their implementation. And there were some that said they absolutely need to be there still, and to some degree improved. And then there was some concern about electric vehicles on sidewalks specifically. I didn't hear a lot of that for roadways or multi-use paths. And then the whole general question of, hey, shouldn't we just be fixing our streets so that they're not vehicle centric anymore so we can bypass most of this? Anyone else had anything I missed, or is that a pretty good synopsis? Cool, I don't see anyone. DK and transportation staff, is that all good for you?
Yes, thank you, Adam, and thank you very much, City Council. We really appreciate your input. This has been very helpful for us as we move into the next stage to look at these ordinances, and we'll be visiting with you again in January.
Thank you so much, DK, and all of transportation staff who helped us out tonight, and Tab and everyone who contributed. These were great presentations. They were really easy to answer the questions you asked, and we always really appreciate that when things are teed up super well. So this was awesome. Thank you so much. It was really productive and efficient. With that being said, I wanted to recognize this is our last public meeting with Jane in our presence. So unless she wants to come testify in front of council, which I don't see happening anytime soon, I just wanted to say thank you again, Jane, and allow a little space for anyone who wanted to say any more goodbyes in our public open comment here. Bob, I have you.
Yeah, I know that we toasted you last week, and I hope that after COVID is over, we can have a big party to toast you some more. But I just want to observe the fact that in your 12 years here, at roughly 50 council meetings per year, you've tolerated 600 sets of council meetings here in Boulder. And I know that you were city manager in other places before this, and I appreciate you putting up with us, for leading a fantastic staff. I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, we're going to miss you very much.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to miss all of you so much as well. It's been a great ride. I'm honored. Thank you.
And I have Aaron.
Well, I've said goodbye a couple times, but I just wanted to offer up. You remember from Car Talk, and they would say, did anybody watch that, listen to this? They say, well, you've just wasted another perfectly good 2.5 hours of your life at a city council meeting, but never again.
Yeah, yay.
Get your Tuesday evenings back. So enjoy them.
Thank you.
Sam?
Thank you, Jane, for all your years of service. Sad that this is the last meeting we'll have you at, but I look forward to seeing you around town, looking much more relaxed, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sam. Thanks to all of you.
Anybody else like to weigh in? Perfect. Well, Jane, the best I can give you is 24 extra minutes of your life, and I'm glad we could provide you with an efficient meeting for your last meeting. So
super. Thank you,
that's
Adam.
my gift to you.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Nice job, Adam.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, good job, Adam.
I will adjourn the meeting now. Thanks for a great study session, everybody.
Adam, you are currently the champion, the shortest meeting of our council tenure. Fantastic job. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good night, everybody.
All right.